You've probably adopted this popular training style unknowingly, and it is costing you both strength and size. For a while now, bodybuilders have been at a loss as to how to actually approach training for their desired goals, and many of you have likely conflated the sport of competitive powerlifting with bodybuilding. The reason for this false equivocation is likely because strength training has been around for longer and has therefore dominated gym culture. Add to that the fact that the majority of movements and the equipment used by both strength athletes and bodybuilders is largely the same, and you can see why it is only natural that most gym-goers intuitively emulate the training styles of strength athletes. Powerlifting, however, is predicated on athletes competing in lifting as much weight as possible on very particular compound lifts, those being the bench, squat, and deadlift, while a bodybuilder is ideally focused exclusively on building muscle by utilizing the most hypertrophic training regimen tailored to his specific goal. This is often achieved by altering your technique or manipulating an exercise into a mechanically disadvantageous setup so that you may maximally stress the muscle by using minimal weight. This completely opposes the approach of powerlifters, who follow very particular guidelines when it comes to technique, use lifting implements like knee and elbow sleeves, wrist wraps, and so on, to make the lift as easy as possible from a mechanical standpoint, thereby allowing them to lift as much weight as possible. For a bodybuilder, however, it can often be beneficial to shorten the range of motion by cutting out the squeeze or not fully locking out, thereby keeping tension on the muscle. Additionally, you would ideally minimize using the elasticity of your connective tissue to bounce the weight back from the stretch position, and instead allow the weight to stretch the muscle, keep it stretched for a brief moment, and then explode the weight back while maintaining tension on the muscle throughout the movement. So in summary, a powerlifter cares about lifting as much weight as possible on very particular compound lifts, while a bodybuilder cares about building muscle and should ideally care little about how much weight he can actually lift. Adding weight to your compound lifts does not necessitate substantial growth, so the way that you're moving is not really relevant if your goal is purely hypertrophy. And I understand that strength training and hypertrophy training are initially synergetic, but even still I believe that the debate on powerlifting and bodybuilding hybrid programs is a waste of time, and that you should specialize as early as possible in your lifting career. In other words, choose the training style which aligns with your goals. Forget this hybrid athlete stuff. You should either be a bodybuilder or a powerlifter. I'm a big proponent of specialization because whenever you're pursuing two or more goals which are diverging from one another, they'll inevitably come to compete for your time and attention, and you will inevitably come to prioritize one over the other. But even more importantly, you'll never be able to excel at either of those two. This is because you can only give 100% of your time and effort into any number of pursuits that you have. So let's say the program you're following consists of 70% bodybuilding and 30% powerlifting style training, which usually isn't the case, rather it's the other way around. You're only giving 30% of your effort into powerlifting, which is obviously not enough for any meaningful results. And again, I'm well aware that these two goals can be pursued simultaneously for a long time, but eventually you'll come to a point in your lifting career, hopefully sooner rather than later, when you will realize that whatever your goal is, it requires 100% of your concentrated effort to reach an elite level at. And this goes for anything. And I do get the appeal of wanting to lift heavy and to crush PRs, but this type of training is not conducive to most muscle growth. And the chasing of PRs on the big three is necessitated by such a program which usually incorporates few elements of bodybuilding into a largely powerlifting biased program. Also, we tend to forget that powerlifting is a sport, and as such, it favors a particular build. Much like basketball favors tall athletes with longer limbs, or swimming favors a torso-dominant build with a large wingspan, powerlifting also favors a particular body type as well. That being, lifters with shorter limbs. This is because A, shorter limbs provide for good leverages, and B, they minimize the distance the bar has to travel on compound lifts. If you fit this profile, you very well might benefit from this type of bodybuilding powerlifting hybrid program. But if you're a taller individual, these compound lifts will not provide you with sufficient stimulus for optimal muscle growth. I, for example, have a particularly wide stance when squatting. My feet almost form a 180-degree angle when I squat, and I hinge at the hips first and then the knees, which is not standard squatting form. Standard squatting form is you're supposed to bend your knees first and then the hips. But if you're taller or if you have longer femurs, unless you use heel elevation, starting your squat by bending at the knees first would invariably lead to you falling forward or rather back onto the bar if you're using any significant weight. Another example, if you have longer arms, you probably know that bench press is not the best bang for your buck exercise when it comes to chest gains. Another big issue I have with powerbuilding type training, and this is very prevalent, is the false belief that doing a ton of volume in your compound lifts will somehow bleed over into all of your smaller muscle groups, and that these lifts alone are what get you big arms, forearms, calves, and so on. Just lifting like this is not enough to get big biceps, triceps, or even shoulders. People often misconstrue that isolation exercises somehow do not work unless they're preceded by heavy compounds. And I believe this became a popular idea a while back when optimizing your testosterone levels first became a thing. People would reference studies that found that compound lifts boosted testosterone and subsequently concluded that unless your isolation exercises are preceded by heavy compounds, that you won't have the hormonal base to grow any muscle. Or in other words, that isolation exercises do not work by themselves, which is obviously false. The actual reason you'd want to prioritize compounds over isolation exercises is because they're more fatiguing. And since they work several muscle groups simultaneously, if you do isolation exercises first in your workouts, they would likely be a hindrance to your performance on your compounds later on in your workout. For example, let's say you wanted to do bench press for chest growth. If you proceeded with a set of lateral raises, skull crushers, and cable pushdowns, your ability to perform would invariably be diminished. Even though the bench press preferentially targets the chest, the sheer fatigue accumulated by these accessory muscles would definitely cause a dip in performance. But do keep in mind that it is perfectly acceptable to do isolation exercises first for your lagging muscle groups, even at the expense of your performance on your compounds later on in your workout. As a matter of fact, it would be very beneficial for you to preferentially treat lagging muscle groups in your workouts. But doing so would necessarily mean that you're following a purely bodybuilding program, because you would be prioritizing hypertrophy over strength. And that is the main issue I have with PowerBuilding. And yes, I do know that you can be aesthetic and strong. I acknowledge this fact already. But think of the strongest athletes you know. Do they really have physiques of bodybuilders, or are they a bit fat? With that, I conclude the video. Thank you for watching.